event. Actually, I am very emotionally overwhelmed. I have seen this film several times before, but each time I get so overwhelmed, overcome almost. Anyway, okay, let's talk about the facts, about how we survived in the aftermath. That's what you're talking about. Exactly. Well, that by the end of that year, 1945, 140,000 people lost lives. I say by the end of 1945 because many people died since then because of the radiation. They say about 100,000. So together, about 240,000, a quarter of a million. That many people's lives were sacrificed. Anyway, people in Hiroshima were very anxious and fearful before that happened because the United States started carpet bombing in Tokyo. I think it was April 1st of that month. And over one night, 100,000 people were killed over one night. And that was the beginning of the carpet bombing of Hiroshima, the Japanese cities. About 70 cities have been attacked with incendiary bombs, starting with the biggest capital, Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, Yokohama, and so on. Hiroshima at that time was considered to be 10th largest city of Hiroshima. But they started attacking smaller cities, smaller than the 10th one in Hiroshima. Why? And we started feeling very jittery. Why Americans are so good? They're saving us. Little did we know at that time, Hiroshima was purposely being kept intact because government wanted it to be that way. Because I think in July 16th, and the President Truman learned that about the successful explosion, detonation of the first nuclear weapon. So he was very confident he could finish Japan by themselves, the United States by themselves. No longer had to depend on the USSR. They had tried to get them to join the Allied forces. So before the Soviet promised 3 months after Germany's surrender, the Soviet Union would join United States Allied forces and come and finish Japan together. That was the understanding. But after getting the good news that the new bomb was successful, and Mr. Truman didn't want Stalin, before Soviet had the chance to join, they wanted to use 2 bombs as quickly as possible. And that's what happened. Anyway, with that kind of things going on, Hiroshima was attacked. Now, let's first talk about the physical. I think you people must have done a lot of reading and have seen the picture of physical destruction. And to some extent, human suffering, how medically they were affected. There were other factors we have to consider later, but I said by the end of 1945, 140,000 people were killed by the effect of radiation. But the horrible story about that is that radiation is still killing hibakusha. Even today, 78 years later, that's the horrible news. In Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there are atomic bomb hospitals. And both of them have been packed all these years. And they are still dying as a result of radiation. Let me see. As I told you, I have been emotionally overwhelmed, so I may not follow orderly way. I think you can interrupt and you can raise a question. But medically, many people suffered from something people, even the doctors could not understand. If somebody had the fever, they thought maybe that's scarlet fever, and there were no medication. It was a pretty bad situation. About 80% of healthcare professionals killed themselves. So you heard my personal story of escaping to the training ground. In that huge training ground, about the size of 2 football fields, and I didn't see one single doctors and nurses. They themselves were killed, and the remaining healthcare professional people maybe assisting somewhere else, but not where I was. Anyway, there are all kinds of symptoms like loss of hair, bleeding, internal bleeding, and bleeding from the gums and so on. I myself had a bit of that. But since I was inside the building of the Army headquarters, I must have been protected. I didn't lose that much hair. But let me tell you, most of my schoolmates that day were in the center part of the city. Like the rest of the high school students, from all the high school students of the city, all the grade 7 and grade 8 students were there in the center part. They were involved, they were engaged in the physical labor and to build the fire lanes. So most of my schoolmates were there. They say about 7,000 people were there. They were in the center, right below the detonation. By the time that huge fireball came down to the ground, it generated 4,000 degrees Celsius. 4,000 degrees Celsius. That's the kind of heat that I understand them. Iron melts above few hundred degrees, but human beings on the ground level at the heat of 4,000 degrees Celsius, they were simply vaporized, incinerated, and carbonized. That's what happened to most of my schoolmates. 351 of them were there. My own sister-in-law was there supervising students. And my cousin was there. My best friend was there. For some reason, she survived. She spent some time with those dying people. And she came back to school and told us what happened to those people in the last hours of their lives. Well, Setsuko Muramoto. She had the same name as mine. And when the school opened, we were so anxious to see who survived. Everybody was anxious to come back and have the reunion. And this girl told us that those people at the center of the city were just so swollen and they couldn't see. Their eyes were so swollen. But by voice, they could recognize each other. So they crawl toward each other. And the teacher said, well, let us sing the hymn. So she told me that they were singing Nearer to Thee, My God. Is that the title of the hymn in English? And that was our favorite one. And apparently they sang, and one by one, they passed away. Anyway, that was a very shocking story, but one of the very rare story we know of at that last moments of dying people in the center part of the city. Anyway, there are all kinds of stories like that. But the people who survived, lucky enough to survive, ended up having that very unsightly keloid scar all over the bodies, or particularly on the faces. And that was very important for the girls, especially in the marriageable age. Marriage was important for the girls in Japan at that time. And they just couldn't go outside. They kept themselves in isolation because they didn't want to be ridiculed. And we heard not the rumor, the truth, but the very limited information. There were many women who were pregnant at that time, had babies, but they were not complete and healthy. They had disability. That's the word we use nowadays, deformed babies. We have seen some pictures, but that kind of information was quickly gathered up by the American occupation forces, shipped back to the States. Now, I mentioned, anyway, because of those things, that the women who happened to be in the city at the time, who were exposed to radiation poison, they said, and they are dangerous people. It's contagious. So your sons should not be marrying the woman who were exposed to radiation. And that kind of rumor started. So there was a serious social discrimination. That was a real problem. And that prevented the survivors to keep their mouths shut because they didn't want their daughters not to be qualified to be married or not to be employed by the companies or factories and whatnot. It was the safest thing to keep mouths shut and not to say to anybody that you were there in Hiroshima. So that's a kind of, it's a real psychosocial kind of suffering they had. So physical destruction of the city, the entire city just was wiped out. Dear place, church, shops, barber shop, hairdressers, schools, parks, everything all of a sudden disappeared. You can just imagine yourselves in your own community. What would that be like? That's what happened. In addition to losing all the loved ones, families, friends, schoolmates. So human loss, physical loss, and social discrimination, medical problem for which there were no adequate care because doctors were not equipped to treat the problem. They didn't know. And no medication. But the situation which intensified the problem is this. 2 days later, Japan finally surrendered. That meant quick arrival of occupation forces. Allied forces, we said, but mostly Americans. Supreme Commander General MacArthur said, our objective, our goal being here is to achieve 2 things. One is to demilitarize Japan. And secondly, democratize Japan. Yes, people were more than ready to see the demilitarized country of Japan. They were sick and tired of Japan fighting for 15 years. Life was getting harder and people were starving, very limited food supplies. But, oh yeah, I'm sorry. And so General MacArthur's goals were okay, good. And as a matter of fact, there's some good things happen because of his goal. And women for the first time were able to vote, participating in political activities, and reforms in the finance, labor relations, education, all the necessary things happened. That was great. But as far as Hiroshima and Nagasaki were concerned, he did the opposite. First of all, introduction of the atomic bomb hospital in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. People were so happy. Finally, we get medicine. Finally, we have the doctor who know how to deal with the radiation poisons, so forth and so forth. But soon, people found the only American purpose for establishing ABCC, Atomic Bomb Casualties Commission, was not to treat the suffering people, but to study the effect of radiation on human beings. You can imagine how the survivors felt. They felt, well, they were treated as a guinea pig, not just once, but twice. First, as being used as a target for testing the new type of weapon. And secondly, to study the effect of that bomb on human bodies. What does that mean? They want to find out and they want to be prepared for the future bomb making. This kind of question naturally leads, right? Then censorship. Newspaper wanted to deal about human suffering. And they started doing it. And I know that Japan's largest and most highly respected newspaper, Asahi, was ordered to shut the shop because they wrote too much about human suffering caused by the atomic bomb. That was a no-no subject. And worse still, censorship was not enough. They started confiscating survivors' diaries, correspondences, or some literary writing when their hearts were filled with pain. The only comfort is by expressing their pain in the form of literary form. They write poems, short articles, and so on. This kind of creative things and medical chart, anything which show the human suffering were confiscated. I think it was about 32,000 items of all those things were collected, confiscated. They were shipped back to Washington. And occupation forces told us, well, don't worry about being in Hiroshima. Well, those radiation, well, that's not so dangerous. And besides, all the rain just washed them away. So it's safe enough, live there. And that kind of false information, disinformation, misinformation, half-truths, and lies, and secrecy. Those were the words which explained our lives at that time. So you can imagine physical destruction, medical effects, no food, no homes. People had to go outside the city, hoping their friends and relatives would keep them, feed them, and clothe them, like my uncle did for my family. I was extremely fortunate, but many people weren't lucky to have such supportive relatives outside the city. Many people left the city far away, went to Tokyo or Osaka and so on. Those people in the faraway cities hardly knew what happened in Hiroshima because communication was very poor at that time. And with the destruction of the entire city, no radio and so forth. So they kept hearing and spreading the wild rumors. We were untouchable for some time. And that was an important reason for the silence kept by many of the survivors. Let me see. Yeah, in October, a couple months after the bombing, my school owned the land in the mountain. So they built the temporary huts and called it school. So I had to walk about 2 hours to get there and come home 2 hours. But still, I was anxious, like everybody else, to get there and attend the school. That started in mid-October. It had a, it had a tin roof. Every time it rained, it was so noisy, we couldn't hear the teacher. No window, so we froze to death, but we're still happy to find each other. The teacher take the attendance every day. And Miss So-and-so is not here today. She passed away yesterday. Oh, Miss and so-and-so died last week. Every day we started hearing the death announcement. And I noticed many girls were wearing the heavy, thick, quilted bonnet. Those were the things we had to wear during the wartime to prevent our brain in case of attack. The war ended, but still girls were wearing. Why? Well, they wanted to hide their bald heads. As I told you earlier, they were losing hair. They were too ashamed to come to school, be seen by their schoolmates, the bald heads. So there's now my favorite uncle and aunts. We were so happy to hear they're alive, they survived, and they had no external injury or anything. They are not burned, they are not crushed. But then, a week later, 10 days later, they started developing purple spots all over their body. After my sister died, my mother went and looked after them. And according to her report, their internal organ and tissue seemed to be rotten, coming out as a thick, dark liquid or something like that. So after a while, they started developing those purple spots. There's something to do with the blood. I can't explain medically. So in those days, first thing we did in the morning before we get dressed was to check every part of our body, make sure there was no purple spot. Because once you find it, your time is short, limited. That was the kind of very anxious, fearful days we were having. I can go on and on and on, but
yeah. Thank you, Mrs. Setsuko, for the comments. The second question that I would like to ask you is that, as the movie briefly shows that you faced a lot of abuse. Can you hear me?
Yep. Okay.
Hi.
Speak slowly.
Yeah. As the movie briefly showed that you faced a lot of abuse in the initial days of your anti-nuclear activism, what motivated you to keep on going in this direction?
Yeah. Well, you can see all of us, we're fortunate we survived, but still life after that experience was very tough. I don't know how we survived. I don't know how adults coped with that to make sure that their children are fed and housed and clothed. You see, in the city, you see, before the bombing took place, grade 5 and 6 children were all evacuated out of town just to protect them. So the war ended. They came back. There was no city, no houses, no family. About 5,000 of orphans running around in the ashes, in the debris, with no one taking care of. And I am so troubled to say, but 12 years after the end of the war, central government didn't lift a finger to help survivors in my city, in other cities too, I suppose, but particularly in the hopeless city like Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Can you imagine? The government did nothing to support, to help survivors. So, of course, I was only a teenager then. I was not fully grown up. I didn't know enough of morality or international relations or history or political science. But adults, mature adults, began to understand what the meaning of survival was. The occupation forces were feeding us all the lies and even justifying the use of the bomb when Japan had already finished with the capability to continue fighting. And Japan had made an overture for the acceptable surrender. Mr. Truman knew all about those things and the people around the president, but still they went ahead, decided to use it before the Soviet Union came to join together to finish Japan. Well, I'm sorry, it's a very complex story, and I suggest that you do your own reading. But we knew that the bombing was carefully prepared. For example, what part of the day to use? Not when people were safely sleeping in their body, but when the people were up and on the streets, going to school, going to work. That was a time. So every aspect of the bombing was carefully prepared.
So, Mrs. Setsuko, we wanted to ask that as well. Like, what do you say to people when they say that the use of the bomb was justified? I mean, you kind of touched on that, but like in conversation, like what's an argument, or how can we possibly convince people that there's no justification?
Yeah, I would be interested to hear with what reason that kind of question can be raised. It was justified. It was okay to kill 140,000 people in the city of Hiroshima at that time. And that was okay. That's the justification of the use of bomb, right? I want to know the basis for saying it was okay.
Yeah, well, I guess that's what a lot of people say, like looking at
certainly what I learned in the war is the preciousness of each and every human life.
Oh,
when
Arthur also has
collective death and massive murder is acceptable, it's okay. That's totally unthinkable. Why this justification of such atrocity? Why?
I see Arthur. I'm sorry to interrupt. I was going to say we're at 1:34, and I know we had a limited time, but Arthur, I think, wanted to add a point to what you were saying.
Just a response to your question, the U.S. justification was that if we don't drop that atomic bomb, there would have to be a huge American invasion of Japan in order to end the war. That was the justification. Gar Alperovitz, more than 2 decades ago, looked critically at that in a book called The Decision to Use the Atomic Bomb. He came to the conclusion that a negotiated surrender from Japan was achievable, but the Americans were demanding unconditional surrender. So the idea was that the justification for dropping the bomb, we don't want to have to sacrifice Americans' lives with an invasion of Japan. That was an illegitimate justification. In Gar Alperovitz's view, in this book, The Decision to Use the Atomic Bomb, a negotiated surrender was possible. In fact, the Japanese had already, through the Russians, had already begun trying to get a negotiated surrender. So this is Gar Alperovitz's book, The Decision to Use the Atomic Bomb. I haven't read more recent books specifically about this issue. I hope that helps. Thanks.
Thank you, Arthur. I'm just looking at the time.
If gentlemen would like to discuss that, let me see. I think that gentleman must read more than one book. There are a lot of books written on this issue. And the majority of today's historians of the United States are saying different things. About the invasion of Japan, that was not planned until November. But bombing took place in August, 3 months ahead of that. Why? Why the hurry? You know, that kind of things. That's historical facts, which the gentleman can find out. And as I have mentioned it, and that's before the Soviet Union fulfilled the agreement with the Allied forces that they would join 3 months after Germany's surrender, which was May the 8th. So the timing was very important for Americans. Before that date comes, they had to use that, both of them, not just the Hiroshima, and test out what happens, but both of them have to be used. And there are all kinds of historical error in that gentleman's ideas. And that's why it's important to read the books by other historians, not just one historians. So that was historically inaccurate, incorrect information that gentleman is basing that question. So I would say to get more honest, straightforward, truthful information on that is by going to a library and read other historians' articles. I can give you them. You know, recently people saw Oppenheimer's film, right? That was written by Martin Sherwin. He's a good historian. He passed away, unfortunately. He and Kai Bird, both of them wrote that story together. Both of these are very respected historians. Our Perovitz, my good friend Peter Kuznick at American University in Washington, D.C. There are quite a few people specializing in that part of American or world history, I should say. So I suggest the further reading. So I'm sorry, coming back to the chairpersons, and you were suggesting?
Oh, okay. So I'm just, Shinobu's just writing to me. There's Amir, he can, she just wanted to switch it over to him to ask a short question, and then we're going to wrap up after this. So I'm going to unmute you, Amir, or are you able to unmute yourself? Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I joined late, sorry. It's a quick question. The youth nowadays, do they still remember that tragedy? And second thing is, what are their feelings towards United States going through this?
I am hard of hearing, so would you please?
Yeah. The youth, do they still remember that tragedy, the current youth? And second, how they feel towards United States doing this atrocity on Japan?
How do I feel about this atrocity?
The youth.
Youth, today's youth?
Yeah.
Where? In Japan or in the States?
In Japan.
Well,
are they angry towards US?
I don't live there, but I often make visits. I just came back from Japan after 4 months stay, and I had a lot of contact with the young people. The people I spend time with mostly are the people who are engaged in the work of getting rid of nuclear weapons. So they agree with the way we feel that as long as nuclear weapon exists on Earth, there is no guarantee of safety and security. And I am delighted a lot of young people in Hiroshima are working on that. What's that question? Well, but Hiroshima and Nagasaki are different though. You know, they still have parents and grandparents and uncle and aunt who can tell them exactly what happened. So they feel the issue of life and death more intimately, so close to them. They do a lot of thinking. And their decision is, we simply have to fight against this. Thank goodness. But in the rest, the other part of the Japan, of course, there is a lot of concern. Their life is so comfortable, easy. They don't want to look back the history and the meaning of the survival in nuclear age today. Yeah. But I can say at least one thing. In Hiroshima, Nagasaki, they do a better job. In other parts of the city, the other part of the Japan, maybe they don't. But one thing I am clear is they do a lot better than it is here in Canada. I am grateful for that. Because I think partly media is very interested in working with the citizen. I think working together with the media is very important. And I think, generally speaking, Japanese know what Japan went through during the Second World War. I think everybody has learned about the preciousness of life, folly of war. And there's a lot of worry and concern about the way governments are behaving, including their own governments. Yeah, sorry.
Okay, I'm going to jump back in. I know everybody has so many questions, and we had a few questions in the chat and private ones as well, but it is 1:43, and I know, Mrs. Setsuko, you have some other, oh, there's more things coming in the chat. You have some other obligations today, so we promised to.
Fine. Next 15 minutes, I'm willing to, that's fine.
Yeah, okay, wonderful. In that case, we had a question from...
The thing I want to say, you know, it's okay to look back what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki and how we coped with it. But I think most important here now is how Canadians have to live with this issue. What are we doing to prevent another Hiroshima and Nagasaki? What is Canadian government doing? Are we in communication with the government? Do we have any kind of communication through member of parliament or write the letters to the politicians? I notice there's very little communication between the government and people, and media doesn't do a decent job, and the school system is not doing hardly any good job. Parents are not teaching the children because they grew up without knowing, understanding. Somehow this whole mess has to be changed. I think Canada can be a responsible member of the world community. It has not been for a long time. I remember the days in 1978, I went to the United Nations, and Senior Trudeau made a very good speech. He talked about suffocation of nuclear arms race. You can understand the suffocation of that kind of thing. He was courageous enough at the UN talking about it. Of course, he made himself very unpopular with American officials, but he gained a lot of respect from the world. And Mr. Axworthy, another foreign minister, he did a great job. The world admired him, about the landmine issue. Ottawa provided so much support, and they worked together, citizens group and government worked together. I think Mr. Axworthy gave so much support and leadership. I was so proud. And in Japan, they published a book. It said Ottawa process. That was the term used, Ottawa process. And I was so proud of Canada. But that kind of spirit seemed to have disappeared. This young gentleman, Mr. Trudeau, doesn't want to talk about this issue. Privately, publicly, in the parliament, with the press people. And that's a crime. He is responsible for the well-being, safety of Canadian people and for the people of the world as a member of the world leadership. I am brokenhearted about the way Canada is now. And I think each one of us, as a responsible citizen, has a responsibility to make our government work. We have to shake the Ottawa. Write a letter, put your thoughts in your open letter, and send it to the press and send it to Mr. Trudeau. I have to do it again. I have written. He hasn't answered. I don't think he likes my letters. That
so
happened.
This kind.
Yeah. And sorry.
I thought this is sorry. I keep interrupting. It's hard over Zoom. That's what. So Bev had a question. She said, "I'm wondering if the Hibakusha stories are being shared in U.S. schools." And second, I'm wondering what actions are being suggested to influence government policies in the nuclear-armed states, which I think you kind of started talking about. But can you elaborate more on that?
Well, it's a question for yourself, isn't it? Excuse me, I didn't ask. I didn't get that.
What can we do to influence the government policies in the nuclear-armed states? So it sounds like you're saying that there need to be more kind of involvement from everyday people just reaching out to the government. Is that?
Well, I think it's important that we have to start studying the issue more deeply. I think we have to be more familiar and we have to be able to discuss and dialogue with those politicians. And to do that, we can't do it alone, do it together in the form of groups. And as a group, you can read and talk and debate, and you can support each other. And maybe together, you can write something, open letter or private letter, and share that with the politicians, the people who have the power to make decisions on our behalf. I think that's the first step. We have to first learn the issue more clearly, more deeply. But I think we know sufficiently. Massive killing, atrocity is unacceptable. What's happening in Israel and Gaza and Ukraine, that's a crime. We can express our views on that. So first step of political action is study and articulate our feeling with politicians who have the power to make decisions. Because we look at the world and look, but first thing we have to do is to make our own government move. They have to be shaken up, and especially ours, which refuse to sign and ratify this new wonderful treaty United Nations adopted. We worked hard on that. People around the world worked together for 10 years, and we made it possible. We have the treaty, which ban the treaty. But the countries which have the nuclear weapon don't want to get rid of the nuclear weapon. They have given us the very hard time. They sabotage the process of getting this treaty. So unfortunately, it's a real political issue. This new treaty and NPT, I hope we can use together in order to reach to the same goal. But they are arguing they are not compatible. They should be able. Well, we waited for this almost 80 years. We finally got what we wanted. This is only the first step, though. We have a lot more work to do. We just prohibited it. Now we have to eliminate it completely. So how long, how many years do we have to do? We don't know, but we keep fighting toward that goal. And we want all of you to work together. I'm sure you are already involved, or if you're not involved, you will. We must live, right? That's right. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you. We must live. This is a wonderful world, wonderful civilization. We can't afford just to burn it, incinerate it. That's mad